On things like research and development. At the University of Michigan, Dr. Victor Lee is close to perfecting a new kind of concrete, flexible concrete. It's one bright idea that could have a big payoff.
Yeah, well, that's wishful thinking, because pursuant to the scriptures, America is going to be blown out of the earth by thermonuclear destruction. So the hell with Dr. Lee. That's another thing about these Moabites. They're proud, man. You know, when you look at China, China's now they're starting to boast that they're going to be the next empire. Well, in the Apocrypha, it speaks about, I believe it's 2nd Ezra's 16th chapter, it speaks about Asia, which Asia is known as China. China is in that part of the world, the Asian part of the world. It says, "Woe unto thee," which means destruction. Alright, so the Chinese ain't going nowhere, which is the Moabites, they ain't going nowhere. And the so-called white man with his empire, he ain't going nowhere. All these empires are going to crumble, and pursuant to Daniel 7 and 18, we're going to take over, the Israelites. And it's going to be our empire that's next. Alright? And our empire is going to be according to righteousness. And we're not going to have no crumbling infrastructure. Alright, matter of fact, our infrastructure is going to be built by these damn devils. You know, they're going to have plenty of employment in our kingdom, because they're going to build up our infrastructure. And if you want to get an insight to our infrastructure, all you got to do is head on over to Revelation, the 21st chapter, around the 13th verse, and it gives you some insight to our future infrastructure. You know, especially the city of Jerusalem, with the 12 foundations and the gates of pearls, and the streets of gold, literal gold now, not no fake gold, literal gold. That's going to be our infrastructure, something America never had and never will. Alright, okay, so now this part of the lesson is called the glory days, and it's dealing with the infrastructure, well, a broad spectrum of it. The name of this web page is called "Why America Was a Superpower Yesterday," and it's by some gook that wrote it. And I think it's a pretty good article because it covers a broad spectrum of America's problems. It says, since history, nations rise and fall, with new powers replacing the old ones. This is because society becomes more complex with greater development, and this steady growth of complexity usually will hit a point until it becomes a mountain burden to it. And that's where America has become. It's become a mountain burden, especially when you look at the national debt, you know, which stands at what, $14 trillion, heading for $15 trillion. That's a mountain burden, and it's mountain because it grows daily. The debt grows daily. Reading on, it says, becomes a mountain burden to it, forcing growth to decline. Because of this, I believe America's power today is fading. However, let us now look at history to know what drove it to power in the first place. Okay, let's go to the next one. Among decades of the 20th century, I deem the 50s or the 1950s to be a decade that illustrated the pinnacle of American power. Back then, it won World War II with that generation settling down, right? And that generation was called the baby boomers. Alright, and this is what you have now. A lot of that generation is they're in what you call retirement, but that's where that term baby boomers came out of right after World War II. This created a surge in demand for housing, with the population also growing steadily because of the baby boomers. Because of this, consumption was high, and this fueled America's growth engines, ushering in an economic boom that pushed the U.S. to glory. Alright. To add on, The first credit card was introduced in 1951. This allowed people to use debt and leverage money to buy what they wanted. And that activity is what contributed to the national debt of America. All right, they thought this would go on forever, but you can't use debt to pay a debt. All right. In the scripture it says the borrower is servant to the lender. The borrower is the one that's in debt. So another word for servant is slave. He's a slave to the lender. So really, the so-called American public are really slaves to the international bankers, which loans them out that phony fiat funny money, and loans them out that phony fiat money, funny money, for interest, right? Which even contributes more to the debt. Reading on, it says this allows people to use debt and leverage money to buy what they wanted. Coupled with an increased number of shopping centers, huge amounts of capital poured into the economy, and this ensured steady growth, which in turn attracted more foreign investments. And keep in mind, this is in the 1950s, all right? Moreover, there was an increase in the number of interstate highways. Remember the Appian Way? Alright, that's where they got the idea for the interstate highways, from the Roman Appian Way, which was in its day an interstate highway. And that's why Rome had so much activity, because all these cities that you look in here, you look at Roma, look at these different cities, all of them were connected. They had one thing in common: they were connected by this Appian Way, which made business and business essentially, which made it easier to conduct business. Let's go back to this. It says there was an increase in the number of interstate highways and presence of strong growth in the auto industry. This helped reduce unemployment in different states as they became better linked by what? By the interstate highway. So can you see why sound infrastructure is so important? That's how cities are linked. They're linked by the infrastructure. They're linked by the highways. Allowing labor to be more well distributed in the U.S. With robust growth in the auto industry, transport became more readily available. Such improvements in transport and its infrastructure greatly reduce traveling time, allowing goods to be exported faster and capital to flow in more easily. Furthermore, television became the national phenomenon, and demand for services from the mass media grew strongly. Yeah, I believe the term concerning television back then was the golden age of television. All right, you had all these shows, My Three Sons, Twilight Zone even came around around that time, the late 50s. You had these different television shows that made made the average American want to watch TV back then, watch television. Plus, it was a new phenomenon anyway, so it picked up like wildfire. Anyway, and demand for services from the mass media grew strongly. This led to a boom in the media industry, which itself provided a platform for advertising. Yeah, and advertising was real great during the 1950s. All right, a lot of products got marketed through the television, through advertising. They had these slick campaigns. They had these slick poetic lines. That all came out of the 1950s. With businesses having newer and more effective ways to market their products, their operations could expand faster, and with this, America enjoyed higher growth. Right? In addition, Boeing introduced 707, and there was increased glamour for air crew. This caused demand for air travel to rise, leading to bigger airports As tourism flourished, more amenities like hotels and resorts were developed, providing America a competitive niche. All these led to a stronger growth. You can see all this took part within the decade of the 1950s. Also, employees back then could expect company pensions and lifelong health care. Such assurance allowed consumption to rise steadily as employees knew they had a future income to spend. Now, you know what America's heading into now, as opposed to the 1950s, is something called austerity measures. All right. Now, when you have austerity measures, you can forget about company pensions. All right. The very definition of austerity measures means they want the people to sacrifice, and one of the things they want them to sacrifice is their pension. Well, you didn't have that back in the 50s. You didn't have nothing called austerity measures. That was unheard of. Anyway, reading on, it says, and you know America's never going to return to this. Everything that I read that came out of the 50s, America's not going to return to that. America's finished, man. On every level, it's finished. Alright? Such assurance allowed consumption to rise steadily as employees knew they had a future income to spend. As they had no retirement savings, discouraged by the presence of pensions, there was even more income Americans could use for spending. That's not true today. In the year 2011, that's not true today. Alright? Things are tight, man. People are tightening their belts. And it's really going to come into play when you bring in these austerity measures. And you notice, like Elder Tahar made a statement or made an observation that they don't want to bring the media, the American media, they don't want to mention the term austerity measures for America. Or they'll mention it for Europe and the different countries, you know, but they don't like to mention that term austerity measures for America. They stay away from that. It says there was even more income Americans could use for spending. All these entailed rising consumption and increased economic growth. Moreover, China was still a poor communist nation back then. It's talking about the 50s, without strong competition. The U.S. could harness its competitive advantages of free enterprise and Yankee ingenuity more easily. This provided a breeding ground for innovation and creativity, allowing great technological developments and breakthroughs. With this, the U.S. grew faster than other nations which were still recovering from World War II, pushing it towards a golden age. Furthermore, with the U.S. dollar being the world's reserve currency at that time, America was the world's new financial power, as there was high demand for its currency and people had great confidence in it. This allowed the U.S. to develop its military well, providing a strong deterrence to aggressors and expanding its sphere of influence. Such stability and prosperity attracted investors, and when more capital poured in, growth became stronger. That's why I named this the glory days, man. This was the decade of the 1950s. I mean, everything was popping for America back then. In conclusion, because of all these driving factors back then, America was able to secure its status of world supremacy. This allowed it to heavily influence or even dictate world events. Right, and you know what happened here. America got cocky. And they got so cocky that they had this delusion that they could police the whole world. Basically, they became like an empire. Just like the Roman Empire. They followed suit. And we know what happened to the ancient Roman Empire. Well, guess what? The same thing is going to happen to America, but even worse. Alright? It says this allowed it to heavily influence or even dictate world events. However, many of these factors are fading today. Unless the U.S. finds new niches, which is not going to find no new niche. America's finished. Alright? There's not going to be any wonder drug given to America, or that proverbial